Tomorrow on One, Desmond Wilcox follows 7 new black and Asian recruits to the police force through their first 2 years of life as black in blue.
It would be wrong for anyone to perceive that black people did not have the same vested interest in good policing as, say, the white community.
All our recruits know that it's not going to be easy, but it may not have occurred to them that once they put on the blue uniforms, the colour of their skins may make life more hazardous.
You have to accept that there are going to be conflicts with people, police officers and people out on the streets.
Black in Blue, beginning tomorrow at 8 on One.
In 20 minutes, Miami Vice, with Crockett and Tubbs coming to the rescue when one of their own men, Swiatek, finds his gambling debts catching up with him and falls into the clutches of a ruthless and corrupt loan shark. Now it's 10 o'clock and time for the news on BBC One with Philip Hayton.
Police call for a veto over football matches where trouble is expected. The sports minister agrees, but Labour warn against the police being allowed to run sport. President Gorbachev accuses his May Day critics of pushing the Soviet Union towards an abyss. Good evening. A call by the Chief Constable of Dorset for police to be given the power to veto football matches threatened with violence has received the backing of the Sports Minister Colin Moynihan. Brian Waite's call follows the weekend violence in Bournemouth in which hundreds of football fans, mainly from Leeds, ran riot. The violence has seriously jeopardised English clubs' chances of playing in Europe next season. The European Football Authority UEFA has brought forward to the end of this month a meeting to decide the club's fate.
The weekend violence in Bournemouth was predictable and anticipated fully by Dorset police. For that reason, and in order to try to prevent a repetition, there's been the strongest possible insistence today that the police should have the power of veto over fixtures they consider likely to cause public disorder.
I've asked them on many occasions, and so did Superintendent Burns, my Assistant Chief Constable, to change the date. They refused to do this, apart from, in spite of the information that we gave them. I'm going to approach the Association of Chief Police Officers with a view to going to the Home Office to get this power.
If you simply veto one match, then I think you have to look at the whole of the programme to see where that match could then be slotted back in. And my fear would be that you might just create more difficulties than you would solve.
The Sports Minister, Colin Moynihan, is siding with Dorset police in the law and order row over match postponement. He's flying to Italy tonight to study World Cup preparations.
Games must be postponed. Games must be moved to other times or indeed other days if the police fear that the sort of incidents that we saw this weekend may take place. So yes, I am very strongly supportive.
I'm against the police running sport. It's not their job. Sport is a lawful occasion and therefore the police have a job to protect it. Up here in the Midlands, we had the West Midland Police in the FA Cup this year demanding that West Bromwich Albion and the Villa match be played on a Sunday. It's not their duty to do that.
There's also disagreement between the two clubs involved about who should pay for the damage. Bournemouth say it must be Leeds. Leeds say they aren't responsible, that they tried everything within their power to prevent violence. Meanwhile, 25 Leeds followers were in court today. They were either remanded on bail or bound over to keep the peace. The international repercussions will be discussed at Wembley this Saturday in a meeting between the Sports Minister and the new UEFA President, Lennart Johansson. UEFA want assurances from the government before readmitting English clubs to European competition.
I hope that he will give me a straight answer when I'm asking him whether he thinks that this is the right time to try to bring English clubs back to European football again.
Vienna on May the 24th is the new time and place for UEFA's decision, almost certainly against English re-entry, unless the Sports Minister can persuade UEFA to stick to its original deadline of after the World Cup.
We must see whether or not the fans can behave throughout the World Cup. In addition to that, UEFA will need to assess the behaviour of the English fans throughout the domestic season. This weekend will have done a lot of damage to the possible return of English clubs next season.
English football has been urging the Minister to remind UEFA that the majority of fans are well behaved. One First Division chairman told me today that if the decision depends on one isolated incident, then English clubs will never get back in. And there's a demand for more even-handedness from UEFA. Other European countries have hooligan problems, but none have England's blanket ban, which tonight looks like remaining for at least another year.
President Gorbachev has warned that the anti-government demonstrations in Red Square on May Day were an attempt to push the country towards an abyss. Mr. Gorbachev told a military gathering in the Kremlin that certain forces were using glasnost and democracy to pursue their own ambitions.
The jeering crowds who last week called for Mr. Gorbachev's resignation and an end to communist rule have sparked an anguished debate in the Soviet leadership about how to deal with a growing tide of popular unrest. For his first response to the threat symbolized by the May Day disturbances, Mr. Gorbachev chose a powerful gathering of the Soviet military establishment, the hardline generals who've been increasingly pressing for tougher action against what they see as dissident elements undermining the stability of the Soviet Union. And Mr. Gorbachev expressed his sympathy, saying he shared the military's fears about the fate of the country, fears that have been increased by recent events. He denounced the Red Square demonstrators as irresponsible and extremist and called on the leadership to stand firm in its decisions. But he rejected demands from some military figures for a crackdown, saying there could be no return to the years of Stalinist repression. With the world waiting to see how Mr. Gorbachev will respond to the growing pressures on him, the message today seems to be that he is taking the conservative lobby seriously, but that he has no intention of giving in to hardline demands for an end to the civil liberties that he himself did so much to introduce. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
Latvia has sent a letter to President Gorbachev explaining its position following Friday's declaration of independence. It calls for fruitful dialogue and honest cooperation between Moscow and Latvia and promises to respect Soviet interests. But as members of the Latvian parliament were discussing their approach to the Kremlin, some of the Soviet soldiers stationed in Latvia warned that they'd defend the Soviet Union's interests. That drew an angry response from many of those gathered outside the parliament building. There's been no official response from Mr. Gorbachev about Latvia's decision to break away. The Chancellor John Major has said that curing inflation has been more difficult than the government imagined, and he's given a gloomy assessment of the early reduction of interest rates. Mr. Major, who's in Washington for a meeting of the International Monetary Fund, refused to speculate on whether Friday's inflation figure will be above 10%. But at a May Day rally in South Wales, the shadow Chancellor, John Smith, said government policies had put Britain at the bottom of the International Economic League.
The Shadow Chancellor John Smith at a May Day rally in South Wales reopened the attack on the government's economic record. He blamed government policy for causing what's expected to be a steep rise in this Friday's inflation figures.
I think we'll show a significant rise in inflation. Quite how far, I don't know as yet. But the poll tax, which will probably add about 1% on its own to Britain's rate of inflation, will be included. A very startling revelation of how inflationary the government's own actions are.
The Chancellor John Major returns to Whitehall tomorrow from talks in Washington, knowing the inflation rate could be touching 10% for the first time since the early 1980s. But after gaining seats in London in last week's council elections, Tory party managers believe the government has weathered the immediate political storm. Senior Conservatives are playing down the knock-on effect of the poll tax on the inflation figures.
We've known for some time that the figures on Friday are not going to be good, and I think they've been quite heavily discounted. But what we do know is that in a year's time, they're going to be much better. And I think the key thing to note from last Thursday's election is the fact that people vote according to their pockets. And if we can deliver on the economic front, on inflation interest rates, then I think there's everything to play for.
But the threat to the government from the economic damage of the poll tax is that higher inflation is working its way through to wage awards. Next week, 500,000 town hall staff have their pay talks, and a claim will soon be prepared for the council manual workers. Expectations are rising. Last week, the power workers became the latest to get a double-figure wage increase, settling for 10.2%.
Daphne Parish, the British nurse jailed in Iraq, has been allowed another visit from her daughter, who says conditions for her mother seem to have improved. Outside the British Embassy, demonstrators have again showed their anti-British feeling. Our Foreign Affairs editor John Simpson reports from Baghdad.
The calm of the Baghdad streets covers a distinct feeling of hostility here to Britain. The government says there's a conspiracy by London and Washington against Iraq. Each day at the British Embassy there are demonstrations, at the moment small and polite, against Britain's efforts to stop Iraq from obtaining the technology which it says it needs to defend itself against Israel. The demonstrators seem to be referring to the current court cases in Britain over the supergun affair and the nuclear triggers. Inside the British Embassy they've been dealing with another dispute between Britain and Iraq, the execution of the Observer journalist Farzad Bazoft and the 15-year sentence on the nurse Daphne Parish. Mrs. Parish's daughter, Michelle de Vries, and Michelle's stepsister, Martina, visited Mrs. Parish today. They found she was coming to terms with her prison sentence.
She's very, very bored, but she is gradually getting into a routine of, and we've been able to bring in craft works and lots of books for her to read, so she's filling her time up, and she's giving English lessons, and also using her nursing skills to look after the prisoners.
Her morale this time, Michelle said she seemed a little down last time, but I mean I was pleasantly surprised at how, not happy is the wrong word, but how she seemed to have settled in.
But there are problems for the small group of British journalists who've been allowed to visit here. One was arrested this evening and released after 3 hours. And a broadcast which we tried to send by satellite to London this evening was interrupted. John Simpson, BBC News, Baghdad.
The British lorry driver arrested on charges of transporting parts for an alleged Iraqi supergun has been refused bail by a Greek court. Paul Ashwell has been in prison since his arrest in Greece 3 weeks ago. He's since claimed he didn't know what he was carrying in his lorry. The Foreign Office said tonight it was very disappointed at the court's decision. 2 Columbians have been arrested in the United States accused of trying to smuggle 24 Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to a drug trafficking cartel in Colombia. It's thought the missiles were intended for attacks on Colombian government aircraft.
The FBI in Florida proudly showed off missiles of the type the Colombian cartel wanted to buy. Stingers are used to blow aircraft out of the sky, and this $1 million deal might have helped turn Colombia's drug war decisively against the government.
The cash was alleged to have been obtained from the sale of cocaine. Ramos Tanaco also is alleged to have spoken about recently importing thousands of pounds of marijuana into the United States.
The 2 arrested Colombians are said to be associates of the drug baron Pablo Escobar, who U.S. reports say wanted the missiles to assassinate Colombia's president, Virgilio Barco, destabilizing the country. In the run-up to Colombia's presidential election, 3 candidates have already been murdered, and the assassination of President Barco would lead to further demands on the government to give up its crackdown on the cocaine trade. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Washington.
Around 50 women prisoners have been involved in a fight at a Risley remand centre in Cheshire. At least 4 prison officers were injured. At Mountjoy prison in Dublin, a rooftop protest has ended after 28 hours. Prisoners were protesting about the living conditions of inmates who are HIV positive. Slates were ripped off the roof of a section which houses some men with the virus, but there was no serious damage. The prison authorities are considering disciplinary action against those who took part. The Prince and Princess of Wales are tonight guests of the new Hungarian government in Budapest on the first official royal visit to a Warsaw Pact nation. The Prince said that hearts had jumped for joy when Hungary cast aside its communist chains for democracy. Earlier, the aircraft carrying the Princess had to make an unscheduled landing shortly after it took off from Heathrow because of an electrical fault. Emergency services at Gatwick were put on standby but were not needed. The plane later picked up Prince Charles in Italy.
The royal plane finally arrived at Budapest airport just 45 minutes late, and this short but historic royal visit was underway. The Prince and Princess were originally invited by the old communist government, but there's been a revolution since then, and the man who met them off the plane was the country's new president, Arpad Gunz, who had spent 6 years in prison under the communist regime. The royal couple were driven away from the airport to begin their visit to democratic Hungary. Budapest's first free parliament since the war met for the first time last week, and this evening Prince Charles called on its leaders, including the Prime Minister-designate Dr. Joseph Ontal. The Hungarian electorate who put Mr. Ontal in power have by no means said goodbye to their difficulties. Hungarian consumers have a desire for Western goods, but they need Western help in restructuring their own industry to provide more goods for themselves. Otherwise, inflation and unemployment will sour their newfound freedom. Business cooperation will be a recurring theme in this royal visit. This evening, the Prince and Princess were given a formal dinner at the Parliament building, which the Prince spoke out.
Our visit comes at an extraordinary and challenging moment in your history. Having watched powerless and desperate as you endured your tribulations for the past 40 years, our hearts leapt for joy when you finally cast aside your chains and could be your true selves once again.
So Prince Charles has given the royal seal of approval to recent events in Hungary, and he's done it in no uncertain terms. Tomorrow he'll turn his mind to the economy and to the practical ways in which Britain can help. Justin Webb, BBC News, Budapest.
The Spanish Ryder Cup player Jose Maria Olazabal has won golf's Benson & Hedges International Tournament in Cornwall. Despite faltering in a tense finish, he held off the challenge of Ian Woosnam to win by one shot.
2 strokes up with 2 to play, Olazabal looked like throwing away his chance when his approach to 17 took a detour into the Cornish countryside. It was to cost him a precious stroke, while Ian Woosnam, his only real rival, found the fates in an entirely different mood.
He's gone miles left. Well, I think you've seen a minor miracle.
The 3-foot putt would have put the Welshman level. Unaccountably, he missed it, and with it went his chance. He needed a birdie at the last. In the event, the St Mellion Ducks were to prove Olazabal's only distraction, as composure born of Ryder Cup battle brought him his first victory on British soil.
Cricket and Lancashire amassed the biggest county championship score this century, reaching 863 as their match against Surrey at the Oval ended in a predictable draw. Neil Fairbrother finished with 366, the 3rd highest score in championship history. A whole host of records were at Lancashire's mercy as they took their score past 800 and the total for an extraordinary match to over 1,500. Shortly afterwards, they overtook the best this century, then the 2nd highest of all time, ironically made by Surrey. But the ultimate prize, beating Yorkshire's 887, proved beyond them. Elsewhere, Neil Foster made a maiden century for Essex, but Nigel Bryars replied in kind for Leicestershire in the drawn match at Chelmsford. Graham Dilley provided a rare bowling success story as the champions Worcestershire beat Nottinghamshire, and spinner Richard Davis helped Kent to victory over Sussex. David Gower has given England's selectors a timely reminder of his abilities with an impressive innings for MCC against the New Zealand tourists at Lords. Anxious to regain his test place, he made 97 as MCC won by 6 wickets.
A sunny day, but a blot on the Lord's landscape. The construction of a new stand is behind schedule, which means work during play. Even so, the delay will be costly and lost revenue. On the field, the tourists weren't being distracted. Mark Greatbatch dispatching balls to the boundary in a knock of 52, and with Andrew Jones helping New Zealand to 222 for 8. The England manager Mickey Stewart was talent spotting and checking David Gower's early season form.
David has had an injury and he's played very little cricket. I'm here just to have a first look at the New Zealanders and have a first look at things going on generally in this particular game. There's no emphasis towards any particular one player.
But Gower did hold centre stage, and after hitting his first ball for 4, set about the Kiwi bowlers with the range of strokes everyone knows he possesses, but which have been absent from the international scene. He hit 2 6s and 11 4s to delight the large bank holiday crowd. But on 97, he played his first loose shot. A disappointing end, but enough to help MCC to a 6-wicket victory, and maybe enough for an England recall.
And that's all from the newsroom tonight. Good night.